Well, hey, everybody, this is part two of my interview with Michael Sayen and his book, Marriage, Remarriage, and Divorce, mostly talking about the bride price. Today, we're talking about pastors being afraid of feminists, how modern seminaries work, and what they're training people in the modern seminaries, the marriage contract being just really kind of a tax status in a way. Talk about no-fault divorce a little bit and why, if we truly follow the Bible, why we don't need the bride price today. So those are some of the topics we're going to talk about. Stay tuned. Good interview. Get Michael's book. I'll put a link to it below. Here we go. So what I was going to ask you was your book. You said you had like 200 professors or pastors, professors, that
Yeah,
type
mostly professors. Yeah.
professors review it. What was like the main pushback they gave against it?
I got more support than not, which is so what happens is that all the professors, right, for a lot of majority, I'd say about 45% of all the professors really liked the book because it dealt with polygamy, it dealt with bride prices, it dealt with divorce, marriage, and remarriage in a polygamous society in the Old Testament, right? And we're like,
Yeah.
okay, wait a minute, no one's ever applied that before. So theologically, it was tantalizing, for that, and they enjoy that, right? They're like, okay, this is written well enough. And it's definitely something that's no one's ever brought up before that we can find in 2,000 years of Christian history. No one's ever brought a lot of these
Oh,
principles up. And
wow.
so this is really exciting new stuff. Now, the pastors didn't like it because the pastors were like, hey, I don't care about theory. I care about practical application. And your book's just not practically applicable, right? We can't do bride
Oh,
prices. We can't. A polygamous society doesn't exist. So this is really has no.
well,
But it
well, you could almost argue that in the current day, patriarchy really isn't feasible either.
No, it's
Um,
not. It's not. And it's the thing. It's the most important thing is that the churches are slaves to the states. The churches are afraid of the women, right? And the
yeah.
Bible's very clear. If you're afraid of something, that's your master. It rules over you, right? And that's what come and tells us as Christians, do not fear. It says that all over again. Do not fear. Because
Oh,
when we
yeah.
become afraid, but the pastors are afraid of the women. They'll say that they're not, but that's really because remember that they're taught by seminaries, right? We had Timothy, right? Paul talking about, and I think it's in 1 Timothy chapter 4, that Timothy was chosen not by going to seminary, not by a master's degree of theology. He was chosen by the Holy Spirit and then laid on of hands to be able to lead the church. Matter of fact, he fought against this because he was so young, and the other people in the church fought against this. But he was
Yeah.
chosen by the Holy Spirit. Today, you only get chosen if you have a proper master's of theology and so forth. And that puts pressure on people that I have to learn what the seminaries have to teach me. And what
Yeah.
happens is they're so busy learning that bookwork that if they can't push back, or if they do push back, they could get a bad grade, or a lot of them just don't know how to push back or what to push back because they're not taught the full Word of God, but they're taught certain theologies that the universities want to teach them.
Yeah, and the other part of that's completely valid. And so it's like you have that, and you have them wanting to increase their market share by bringing all these females into the seminaries and saying, even if we don't believe you can be the head
Yes.
pastor, well, you can certainly learn all the deep truths of the scripture. And so you have those two coming together. Where it's like, well, we're not going to draw in all these females that'll pay the big money to be in our seminaries if we make them all mad with patriarchy, right? You got to tell them like,
Mm-hmm.
well, no, you're just as good as the men. Just you can't have that top position. And
Mm-hmm. Right. And so a lot of times people, right, and they're like you mentioned the 1950s, right? When we have the push of the what they call third wave feminism or even fourth wave feminism, we have that push, right? We have that push because of in the 1960s, 1950s, we were really strong with patriarchy. We had Leave It to Beaver, and we had a lot of the other shows, and that had to do with feminism really wasn't pushing that hard. We just got done with World War II, and we started having strong family values. But then what happened was in 1960, there's a famous woman who actually is a red pill now, but she was a super huge feminist. She said
Oh,
what happened
Gloria
was
Steinem.
no, she's a red pill now girl, so she's on our side. I forgot her name. She's super famous. But anyways, long story short,
Well, I know
I'll say it.
Gloria Steinem was part of that, but then
It might
she
be her then. Yeah,
doesn't like the. I know she's spoken out against. She calls it like the war on boys. How
yeah, yeah. Then
she's
I think it's
really
her. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay.
So
Yeah, that
what
was
happened?
Gloria Steinem. Yeah.
Okay, so if so what happens was in 1960s, right? We have the creation of the National Organization of Women. What happens was feminism wasn't going anywhere because people didn't want to hear women just cry about themselves. But what happened was is that when they started to introduce children into it, right? They says, no, we're not trying to protect ourselves from abusive men. We're trying to protect ourselves and children. And in the 1960s, what happened was we see a lot of battered houses start to include women and children. And then they went to the federal and state for funding, right? And they got the political influence for it's all about women and children. And so that's when they started, when the women learned that, hey, if we include children on, we're not only defending ourselves, we're defending children, then we'll get the side of the public. So that created, and then that happened, and then 1969 with Ronald Reagan and no fault divorce. But all that started was really in the 1960s when they started to include children and they're, hey, we're not just fighting for ourselves, but we're fighting for the children. And then people's heartstrings started to get pulled on that one.
Oh yeah. If you talk about the children, yeah, they'll give you whatever you want. If you talk about safety or children, you
Yeah,
pass
and that's
any
a
bill you want.
right, and that's the problem. Best interest of the child standards is not about who gets to decide what's the best interest of the child. Before it was fathers knows best, right? So fathers decided what was for the child, but now best interest of the child means that the government choose what's in the best interest of the child. Now this was popular under Hitler. Hitler did this. He's like, hey, if we control the children, right? We control the next generation. And so they would always say we need to do what's best for the children. Well, who decides that? That's the government. So it's the government didn't say women knows what's best for children. They superseded the women and they're good. They went straight to their own pockets, right? And they says, no, we know what's best for the children. So the best interest of the child standard was created from a dubious doctrine called the parents portray doctrine that says that the nation is the parent of the children, right? And that they have, and this came from 1608 from England, when the king was taking care of the children that were being left at the doorsteps of the churches, the babies, because they
Oh,
didn't really have abortions really as much. So they would leave the children in baskets at and so what happens was and also the older people, when they didn't have family to take care of them, these babies and these old people start to become burdens of the state. So the state in 1608 said that, what, we started to get authority over them by saying that, by the parents portray doctrine, saying that we're the overarching parent, because fathers push back and say, well, wait a minute, we have a fundamental right to fight for our children. And this,
yeah.
and right, you guys, we have a constitutional right that you can't interfere with our house, right? We're king of the castle. Well, what the state said was, well, we're not just government, we're also parents. And so therefore we have the inalienable rights, responsibility of children. And they'll usually tell you, well, you have all the rights in the world, men, except for when it comes to safety and protection of the children. But then anything can file under the safety and protection and the education and the financial,
Oh,
abuse of the children. So they
yeah.
that was filed under a dubious doctrine that came from England, which originally was created on Rome in 300 BCE or BC, where they would say to Caesar, our father Caesar, Caesar, you are our father. And they were not only pledging to be able to follow him, but they were actually pledging their inalienable rights to him.
Okay. Wow.
So what happens is that what the main thing is that, okay, when we left the bride price, well, the bride price got
Yeah.
switched over. So the bride price switched over from being payment to the father to being paid to the woman directly, because
Hmm.
not that the fathers didn't want to be able to have payment, but the women, because of industrialization and because they started leaving the home or whatever, they started saying, well, we want our own rights, we have our own authorities, our father doesn't, so therefore you need to pay me the bride price, not pay my father. And so they would have
Hmm.
the father walk them down the aisle still, but that didn't really, like, how many times have you had a woman go to a father saying, we're not asking for your permission, we're asking for your blessing? right? Because women
Oh.
have no longer asking for their father's permission for marriage. They're just saying, hey, well, we're going to get married no matter what. We just want your blessing. So that's the whole thing. Like
Mm.
with fathers walking down the aisle now, they left the authority to fathers say no, right? And be able to say, they used to say, right, hey, is anyone have anything to say for this? Like you're at a wedding. Does anybody have anything to say that why these two should not get married, right? And
Yeah.
if the
Yeah.
father used to be able to say in Numbers 30, it says that he has authority over the woman's oaths. So that means that in her youth and while she lived under his house, that means that she wasn't able to enter into an engagement or a contract or a marriage without his permission. And he had authority the day he heard it to actually nullify any oath that she made either to man or to God. Um,
Yeah, I've gotten a little more cynical when I go to a wedding. Like my wife doesn't even like sitting next to me when we go to a wedding now because when they start taking the vows, I mean, just to me, because I hear so many stories, and I personally know people where it's like these vows are just a joke, like for better or for worse. And I'll lean over to my wife and be like, "Yeah, and it better be for better," you know. And it says
that's
like
right.
for richer or for poorer, and I'll lean and be like,
Mm-hmm.
"Yeah, and it better be for richer, or else you're getting
Mm-hmm.
divorced." You know,
That's right.
it's like these vows are just like who's holding anybody to these vows? The church certainly isn't.
Well,
So
what's happened? So this is important too. I want to back up real quick, talk about the vows.
yeah.
This is really important. So what happened was, a lot of men and people who are for family rights, right? They started pushing against legislation about no fault divorce, and we said, wait a minute. The contract clause of the Constitution says that the government cannot interfere with the private contracts of the individuals, and when two people get married, that's a private contract.
Oh.
The state pushed back, right? Our government pushed back and says, no, marriage is not a contract. Again, it says marriage is not a contract. It's a change of status only. Therefore, no constitutional protections apply under the constitutional clause of the United States
Really?
Constitution. So they actually say now. So you probably don't hear this, but they're actually saying that marriage is no longer a contract. So it's no longer. They're saying what they're saying is that it's not a contract. It's more than a contract, but they're not applying contract principles or contract protections by the Constitution
Oh,
by
wow.
saying that it's more than a contract, and they're saying so the contract clauses don't apply.
Yeah, I think I've heard some people in the red pill space call marriage currently as a tax status. We kind of like what you're saying. It's
Yeah,
just a different
it's
status
it's
that
just a
they
status.
just
That's right.
wow, that's crazy.
And
That
the marriage and the government to be able to control the marriage or the divorce on the back end had to control the marriage on the front end. So when they reason why in 1917 they started pushing more for the marriage license is because as people pushed back, they're like, wait a minute, they changed. So marriage is considered an inalienable right or so it's a non-transferable right. That's a right that the government can't take away from you.
right.
Marriage was followed under that. However, when you have a license, right? They're saying that marriage is no longer a inalienable right, but what it is a permission, and you need to ask permission from the state to get married. So therefore, they took the same way as England took the authority of matrimonial matters in 1957 under the Matrimonial Clause Act in 1857. They took that away from the church. The state, when they did the marriage licenses here in the United States, they took the authority away from the individuals to make their own duties and responsibilities and marriage and their vows, and they took that authority and they're saying now you have to ask us permission. Therefore, we have authority over marriage, and we have authority over marriage. Therefore, we can. And it's just a change of status, and you don't have any constitutional protections in marriage anymore under the constitutional clause. Therefore, we can tell you that no fault divorce can be enacted, and there wasn't really, or nor has there really ever been a really successful pushback against no fault divorce.
I used to think, yeah, we got to get rid of no fault divorce. And that's the best thing for families and whatnot. But here's another thought. Like I think currently with the stories I hear, especially if the wife wants out of a marriage and she can't get a no fault divorce, she has to find fault some way. I think that puts the average man in more danger of being falsely accused of things so that the wife can get out of the marriage.
Well, so here's the thing. So family court was really created in 1917 as well. And that, so marriage used to be under the civil courts. And then what they did is the federal government created courts of equity. So no longer courts of
Mhm.
law. So when you're under a courts of equity in a family court, right, that your constitution doesn't apply. So you don't have constitutional protections in a family
Yeah.
court because they're saying that it's equity and it's based on the judge's discretion.
Yeah, you
So
don't have
what
to prove
happens,
anything, right? In divorce and family
right,
court,
right,
there's
because it comes
no
from their
guilty until
preponderance.
proven innocent or
Right, right. They
innocent
became
until proven.
they become administrative courts, not courts of guilty and innocent, right? Because that's what a court
Yeah.
is. A judge, that's a judge is who's guilty and who's in, and that's why under the but long story short, so I want to go back. Well, the Magna Carta was the whole push about the Magna Carta was that we want a jury to be able to be judged by a jury of our peers. And even in Texas today, if you want a divorce, you can ask for a jury. And during civil courts, when they had divorce, you could ask for a jury. But now the family courts, they says no, we've taken the authority out of you no longer have the constitutional rights. This is a constitutional right, not only in Magna Carta, but a constitutional right in the United States to be
Yeah.
able to have a jury of your peers of anything that when you're dealing with any financial matters of like $20 or more, according to the Constitution. And we're dealing with houses, we're dealing with children, we're dealing with much more. But we're giving discretion to the judge. So what happens if we go back to a fault-based divorce? Now, that's just a fundamental principle. It's not going to solve everything, but what it does is it gives us our constitutional rights back. It goes under the rule of law, where you actually have to be found, you use clear and convincing evidence instead of preponderance of evidence, which is more just opinion of the judge. And it takes away that discretion, and it could possibly even bring back a jury's right kind of thing. So you have a lot more legal protections under a fault-based divorce. Now, number no fault. You have to ask yourself, why was no fault created? No fault was created for one reason and one reason only. It was so that women wouldn't have to prove abuse behind closed doors, because women were saying, hey, I'm being abused, physically abused, but I can't prove it because I'm getting abused at home. And so no fault divorce was created for one reason and one reason only. It was to be able to give women the ability to divorce without proving physical abuse behind closed doors.
I don't know, Mike. It still seems like that's a day because now it's not physical. Now we can say, well, I was financially, I was emotionally, I was mentally, blah, blah, blah kind of abuse. And it's like,
Right. Well, my book too,
okay.
just to let you know, my book too is it explains why women never had the right to divorce. And in the New Testament, Jesus
Mhm.
never came and gave women the right to divorce. And when you're dealing with bride prices, whenever you're looking at any type of nation for the past 3,000 years of history, right, when they had bride prices or high bride prices, they typically don't allow women to divorce, because if they do, they can divorce and have another bride price and then divorce, then have another bride price, and they can collect all this money, and
Oh,
all these guys would be broke. So when we're looking at cultures that practice bride prices, they typically don't allow women to divorce. Now, 75% of
mm,
cultures today globally, nations today globally, practice some type of bride price or dowry. So we not practicing bride price or dowry as a minority. A lot of times we think the Western world is a majority. We're a minority. We're in the lower 25% bracket.
mm.
However, the church changed over in like 1205, and then as well as the Jewish state of Israel, as well as a lot of other nations. But they started saying, well, hey, the bride price, instead of a price being paid to the father of some value, we can just give a ring or a diamond ring to the girl, and that will be the bride price. The problem is with that is that you can't give the
Oh,
bride price to a girl. It becomes a gift, not a price, because you're not paying for anything, right? So it's not a
yeah.
payment. So it doesn't become a contract. So
Well, what about the cultures where it's reversed, where
the dowry,
the
yeah.
like in India, the woman's family has to pay
Yeah, so
the
that actually statistics. I looked into that, and statistically, it is very very rare. They call it a dowry, not a price at that point, because you're not making a
okay.
purchase or a payment. But they're calling it a dowry, where the women have to pay, the family pay something to the man. That's very very rare, right? But whenever you have that, I think you run into a monarchy, right, where you have that. A lot of times in those cultures, probably, and I'm guessing here, but I think that what happens is the oldest living woman in that family has that patriarchal position, so it becomes a monarchy instead of a patriarchy. So
Oh,
you have a really you flip it over, right? So remember, bride price creates patriarchy. No price, right, creates equality, which creates egalitarian society, and then probably a dowry where you pay to the man will probably more likely give more empowerment to the women. But yeah, but just long story short, that's very few that I'm not sure on that last statistics, but we do know for a fact that bride prices creates a patriarchal society. And the laws will have a tendency to stem from the family, from the culture, and from the religion.
Well, yeah, that for India, it always just seemed backwards to me for the family to pay the husband to take their daughter and marry her, which
Right.
is like,
Then the
is,
question is that why shouldn't she have the right to divorce? Right. The question is that if she's paying the man, why doesn't she have the right? So when the bride price becomes a purchase or a payment or what the Jews call to be able to acquire a wife, but when it becomes a pseudo type of purchase, that women loses the authority transfers with that, right? So the bride price is not just buying a wife, but what it does is a transfer of authority from the father to the man. So when you have the dowry, you don't really have a transfer. You have of authority from the father to the groom. You don't have a transfer of authority, right? Because that
yeah,
transfer of authority, it has to be what's called a quid pro quo, right? You have to be able to this for that. So if
yeah,
the father is going to give you his authority, you have to be able to give him something back, and that's the idea of the
oh,
bride price.
yeah, that makes sense. When it's the bride price, sometimes I've heard it explained like, well, you are taking a worker from the father's home.
No, that's more of a agricultural logical like it's kind of a position to be able to to logically argue it. But then you come into a
Okay,
problem when we become an industrial society, right, where we don't have the agriculture,
okay,
and we
yeah,
have the two people who don't live under their father's house, right, which we see in the Bible. Like we see men that they would have the betrothal time, they would build an extension possibly off of their father's house, and then
mm,
what would happen is that she would come over to the father's family. But we really don't have that, right? We have men and women who live in their own apartments, fall in love, get married, live in another apartment, and they call Cuban, and they give all their when their parents need money, right? They just give they give it to the church. So yeah, it's like I said, it's now we don't have to live in the point of the book, or at least my point of my speech is that we don't have to have bride prices. But what happened was the lack of bride prices caused a confusion with gender confusion, and the women more thinking of equality and be able to, if I come in this equally, I want to be able to get out of this marriage equally.
oh,
But
okay,
as Christians, when we teach headship and submission properly, right, in patriarchy properly, we don't need to live in these cultures that practice bride prices and so forth. You should still practice it if you can. You should
yeah,
still give that to the father. And there's a definitely there's a symbol of that. But the point of the New Testament was rather if you live under a Jewish authority or a Greco-Roman society where there was more of a egalitarian society, rather so whatever society you live in,
mm,
Christians can still practice the headship and submission principles in any type of society they live in.
yeah,
But what happens is we don't live that way because the church is not pushing a true patriarchy from the pulpits. They say they are, but then they come in, which I mentioned earlier. They're saying, "Hey, men have 51% of the authority, and women have 49% of the authority, and man has the deciding vote." Right? But that's not the idea. Patriarchy is like 100% authority is to the husband,
yeah.
and
And
so
actually, I think Michael, 20 years ago, that was preached. I don't think anybody's preaching that today. Like
no,
I don't hear anybody even preaching well, he's got the tie vote or the tiebreaker vote.
yeah, you don't even hear that today in church. That's a good point.
Yeah,
You
it's
don't hear
like
that
they
today.
don't even preach the hat anymore,
Yeah,
and
they're not
that was
preaching
bad
anymore.
enough. And
Mm-hmm.
they can't even say it now, which is
Yeah, they
like
can't even say it.
we're just so far gone. So your book is, if you hold up your book one more time, it's Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage. You can get it on Amazon or any place like that, right?
Right, or I'll probably leave a link down below. I'm sure we'll probably have it down your video. But yeah, it's really
Yeah.
cheap, and the a lot of times it's like 99 cents for the ebook, or it's free. Like
Yep.
if you have Kindle. So
All right. Well, that was my interview, part two with Michael Sayen on the book. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And I hope you know that Christ is winning. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Until next time, this is the Postmillennial Man.